It's still a pleasure to introduce my former student, Sener Akturk. Sener, who was undergraduate at the University of Chicago, moved on to work with Eurasianism and others at Berkeley. He's a professor now in the Department of International Relations at Koç University, a comparative political scientist, that's comparative politics, with a focus on comparative politics of ethnicity, religion, and nationalism. Sener wrote a very interesting piece, an article, which we talked about at breakfast, which I hope he'll extend into a book, on how exclusions in the Middle Ages helped make the communities that eventually became nations in Europe. And it's an article called Not So Innocent, because it's actually about the politics of Innocent III, the Pope who carried out these exclusions. You might be very interested in looking at it. It's, I think, a brilliant, brilliant article. He has been a postdoctoral fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and European Studies, a visiting professor in the Department of Government at Harvard University, and the book, which I very much appreciated learning from, Regimes of Ethnicity and Nationhood in Germany, Russia, and Turkey, Cambridge University Press, 2012. It received the Joseph Rothschild Book Prize from the Association for the Study of Nationalities for that achievement. Joseph Rothschild was a professor of mine at Columbia. Took a year-long course in East European. Akturk is also the recipient of the Peter Odegaard Award, Marie Curie International Reintegration Grant, the Bakı Komşuoğlu, did I say that right? Social Sciences Encouragement Prize, the Kadir Has Social Science Prize. You won all these prizes. Turkish Academy of Sciences Young Science Award, the BAGEP Science Academy Award, and the TÜBİTAK Incentive Prize. That's more prizes than I have books. He is an associate member of the Turkish Academy of Sciences. His numerous publications have appeared in many prestigious academic journals, including International Security, Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, Perspectives on Politics, Post-Study, Post-Soviet Affairs, and World Politics. And today, he will talk about pro-Russian Eurasianism in Turkey. Sener, put this on your huddle.
Thank you very much, Ron Hocam, for this generous introduction. It's a great honor to be addressing such a distinguished audience, including my former mentors and many other colleagues that I met along the way, on a topic that is very dear to my heart, in the sense that, as you may have seen in the readings circulated, one of the articles, the primary article that I highlighted for today's talk, Counter-Hegemonic Visions and Reconciliation Through the Past, the Case of Turkish Eurasianism, published in Ab Imperio in 2004, 20 years ago, was actually the first publication, at least in the English language, that I know of, that dealt with pro-Russian Eurasianism ever. And at that point, this was thought of some kind of niche interest of insignificance. And I'm at the same time very glad that I did it, because I thought it was very significant then, and it proved to be more significant in the following 2 decades. And the following publications too, the Fourth Style of Politics, Turkish Eurasianism as a pro-Russian rethinking of Turkey's geopolitical identity, published in 2015, was at the point when Turkish Eurasianism arguably saw its dip point, but was bouncing back. So my advantage and disadvantage in this talk is that in order to really present within 25-30 minutes to you and our global audience, and to allow some time for substantial time for Q&A, I'm going to go in somewhat telegraphic fashion, but slowly, hopefully, over 5 building blocks of this argument, the international domestic historical context of the rise of pro-Russian Turkish Eurasianism, which is a unique historical development for Turkish identity politics. First of all, what is this a case of? This is something I struggled with in between Ad Imperio and Turkish studies publications over the decade. What are these things? Zapadniki, Eurasisti. What do we call them? They are not nationalisms. They are not foreign policies. What are they? I settled on geopolitical identity as what really captures the meso level of identity. It's above subnational and national identities, and it's below some kind of international systemic or foreign policy variable. It's really identity, but it's certainly not national identity. It's geopolitical identity. In the European Journal of Sociology article, I call them supranationalisms. That would be another kind of way to put it. But I think geopolitical identity is an even better concept because there is no reason that they should be constituted out of national units, right? So geopolitical identity, in a way, is an even better description of what I'm trying to get at. So different from just national identity, who are we, or just geopolitics. And in between, and I don't want to open a can of worms, but including the Ukrainian crisis is a geopolitical identity issue, I think. But of course, that's not the topic of my talk today. But I came to realize or appreciate the importance of geopolitical identities alongside national identities and foreign policy making. So the first point, this was a brief and hopefully not too long introduction. The first point, what changed in the geopolitics between Russia and Turkey over the last century that allowed for the rise of pro-Russian Turkish Eurasianism. And this is very, I think, on the one hand, simple, but it's absolutely crucial. And this was my graduation thesis at the University of Chicago, Turkish-Russian Relations After the Cold War, written under the guidance of Professor John Mearsheimer, published subsequently in Turkish Studies in 2006. And the argument is very simple in the sense that for the previous 200, even 300 years, Russia was the #1 military threat to the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. For the first time in 1991-92 and continuing to the present day, for 30 years, Turkish policymakers and public and intelligentsia, you can expand the circle of actors, does not need to worry for an imminent Russian-Soviet occupation. Right? For the first time in almost 300 years, Russian military is not amassed where we almost are on the Georgian-Turkish border across from Batumi, and you don't need to do contingency planning. Could the Russian military be stopped before it reaches the Mediterranean Sea? This is absolutely important from a neo-realist point of view, that there is no existential threat which allows for Russian-Turkish cooperation. Counterfactually, and we are today in Tbilisi, Georgia, which is arguably among the top 3 most important countries for Turkish geopolitics. If Georgia disappeared tomorrow, Russian-Turkish relations would dive. They would really take a turn for the worse, as they were in the 300 years before. And every major Ottoman military defeat in the last 100, 150 years was against the Russian Empire. Like it wasn't against the French or the British or the Austrians since 16th, 17th century. So this also figured a lot in Turkish geopolitical thinking. So this is a very important precondition, and that was my main thesis. The disappearance, the diminution of the Russian threat is the geopolitical precondition for imagining a common future between Russia and Turkey. That's the first brick. The second brick, so that's what changed and why we are in an exceptional window, have been in an exceptional window in the long durée of Russian-Turkish geopolitics. What this allowed for is what I call, as in the title of the article, the fourth style of politics in Turkish geopolitical thinking. What was the first three? Those who study Turkish history might remember the Kazan Tatar Turkish nationalist Yusuf Akturk, who wrote the extremely famous article in 1905, published in the journal Turk in Egypt, where he said there are three styles of politics, üç tarzı siyaset: Ottomanism, Islamism, and Turkism. And as a Kazan Tatar Turkish nationalist ideologue, he favored Turkism as the most realistic, modern, feasible ideology. And that is a watershed in Turkish thinking about the geopolitical identities. And those three options dominated. Ottomanism disappeared and it was replaced, we'll talk about what it was ever replaced with some other substitutes, but Turkism, Islamism, and some other identity usually competed in the marketplace of Turkey's supranational geopolitical identities. And in fact, if you remember Samuel Huntington's famous or infamous article in Foreign Affairs in 1993, The Clash of Civilizations, he says about Turkey, Russia, and Mexico as the three prototypically torn countries between a Western elite and a non-Western population, Mexico, Russia, and then Turkey in this order. And he says, for Turkey, having been rejected by Brussels, the West, and having rejected Mecca, where can Turkey turn to? Tashkent. That's what he says, right? So even writing in 1993, Huntington understandably could think of these three supranational identities for Turkey. Having been rejected from Brussels and having rejected Mecca, Turkey can turn to Tashkent. Whereas, quoting him, I said at the beginning of my article, some Turkish intellectuals from the military political elite in particular thought of a fourth option, Moscow. And that's the rise of Turkish pro-Russian Eurasianism. Now, why this has happened, I've already mentioned the first geopolitical precondition, the fact that Russian military threat was no longer immediate and no longer existential. Now, again, I have to qualify this, and I've qualified it in many much shorter pieces in the Russian Analytical Digest and many other places, memos and publications, because after 2008, Russian military threat did rise with the war here in Ossetia, right? Bombing of Tbilisi, bombing of Monterey airport, which Turkey modernized in Georgia, and Georgia is an absolutely essential military, political, economic ally of Turkey in the Caucasus. And of course, with the annexation of Crimea, which tipped the balance in the Black Sea in favor of Russia, Russia became the hegemon of the Black Sea once again, as it was in the 200 years before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And finally, with the occupation of Syria, which is the most immediate threat, because then you have Russian airplanes bombing, Aleppo and by the Turkish border again. But still, none of this is as threatening as the status quo ante, Soviet Union, Tsarist Russia. So I qualify the 2008 and beyond with a resurgence of Russian military threat, and that explains, I think, many of the troubles that Russian-Turkish relations have suffered, especially over Syria, 2015, the November 24, 2015 being the peak of that. But that's what it is about, the resurgence. The fourth point, I'm actually doing fine on time, assume. So I don't want to rush. So how to ideationally, ideologically cast this new vision. And that's what I was interested in. Not me personally, but as someone studying pro-Russian Turkish relations, how do they justify Russia being the number one ally of Turkey, as its new name by the United Nations is also recognized. Right? So they justify it, as many identity stories are, through a rethinking of the constitutive conflict of Turkish nation building, which is the War of Liberation, right? 1919, 1922, Turkish revolutionary history, mandatory reading throughout the primary school, the elementary school, middle school, high school, right? The struggle of the Turkish Republic. the defeat of the British, French, Greek, Italian occupation forces following the First World War. And the way Eurasianists, the way Turkish Eurasianists recast this constitutive story, and this is what I discuss in part, not just in these two articles, but also in the edited book by Masha Lipman and Alexei Miller, Convolutions of Historical Politics. You can refer to that, Politics of History in the Republic of Turkey. There was, apart from the official historiography of the Republic, much more, almost pro-Westernish, there was always an Islamist, ethnic minority, and far leftist revolutionary challenge to the story of Turkey's founding. And this more far leftist socialist revolutionary challenge to the story of Turkish independence was basically to say this war of liberation was the first anti-colonial, anti-imperialist war. It was anti-Western by definition. It was won through the alliance of Lenin and Akturk. Soviet Union was factually the state that supplied military and economic support to the Ankara government, which was seen as an illegal rebel government by the British and all the Entente powers that dealt with the Ottoman dynasty in Istanbul. That this revolutionary struggle of the Russians and the Turks, the Slavs and the Turkic peoples against Western imperialism resulted in a decade and a half of high Kemalism, which for Eurasianists is the golden age, where, Voroshilov visited Ankara, Istanbul, Izmir. There are, when you travel to Istanbul, you will see in Taksim Square a huge statue of Atatürk, and who are the others surrounding Atatürk is the high point of Soviet-Turkish alliance. Turkish delegation, to a certain extent, represents Soviet interests in the League of Nations, as they argue. The Soviet Union is excluded from the League. Soviet Union is seen as an illegitimate regime by much of the world. So this is, for any ideology, any kind of identity story, you do have a golden age. And this period of 1920s to the mid-1930s is the golden period, a Soviet-Russian-Turkish alliance against Western occupation forces, because Russia, as you very well know, is also undergoing a civil war and multiple interventions by the British and the French to support the whites and to suffocate the Bolshevik government. So this is seen as a common struggle, cast imagined as a common struggle. So that's the interpretation. Okay, and then, yes, so Turkish independence is a kind of pioneer leader of Third World, and Mir Sultan Galiyev, the Tatar communist revolutionary, is kind of a symbol of this struggle. So when, again, you look at the Ab Imperio article, I talk about how Attila İlhan, the leading socialist Kemalist intellectual of the 1990s, if not much earlier, 80s and 70s, wrote at length of Mir Sultan Galiyev as the opportunity lost, some kind of third world international that would give equal status to a nominally Muslim, but of course ultra-secular Tatar, Turkic peoples alongside the Slavs in a kind of world socialist union, right? So, and then in the next step, basically, they depict the following decades as, and I do refer to Trotsky, as the Turkish version of revolution betrayed. That the post-Kemalist and post-Leninist leaders have abandoned this, and Galiyev's execution is a turning point, right? And then the death of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and the coming to power of İnönü, the rapprochement with the West, with the British, the Americans, entry to NATO is kind of the nail in the coffin, that this historical window is closed. And then the Soviet and later Russian and then the Turkish geopolitical identities diverge. So that was a lengthy, perhaps, summary, but I think it was essential, especially if you didn't get a chance to read any of this. How this became relevant again in the 1990s, and I'm going to now tie this to the final brick in my argument, is with the disappearance of the Soviet Union as a military threat, Russian identity, Russian language, the possibility of a Turkish-Russian rapprochement and alliance were desecuritized. Right? If you learned and taught Russian in the 60s and 70s, you were almost certainly considered a communist sympathizer. No one else learned Russian or knew Russian unless they are fleeing Soviet Union. Perhaps that would be the only other exception. So I'd say my generation, the millennials, people born and raised in the 80s and 90s, are probably the first generation who could learn Russian without the stigma of, let's say, being a communist sympathizer, for example. So this allows for imagining such a common front. And more importantly, and this is the political context, 1990s is a time when Turkey is governed by a series of fragile, unstable coalition governments. Almost every year there's a different government. Sometimes it's 6 months, sometimes it's a year and a half. They are all nominally Westernist, pursuing EU membership. And yet inequality is rising. There is a sense of, yes, declining living standards is probably real. And the threat of terrorism and insurgency. The reason I'm mentioning all of this is, and this will be familiar to this audience, I think, 1990s could be and is, in the Eurasianist writing, depicted as the equivalent of a Turkish smuta, the smutnaya veremye, right? The time of troubles. In many ways, how the Yeltsin era is depicted in Russia today. Right? This is the time of troubles. The state and society might collapse anytime because the government and elites have completely surrendered to European Western interests, and they have lost touch with the Turkish/Russian public. So this allowed, when I wrote this article, Eurasianists of the late 1990s and early 2000s to say, we have the same history, same troubles, we are in the time of troubles in 1990s. The only way we can re-emerge from this is by repeating the original formula. Lenin, Akturk, whatever would be the equivalent, a Russian-Turkish alliance is going to rescue the Turkish and the Russian state from certain collapse. That is how this story is brought to the 1990s. And as you may have seen in the opening paragraphs of both articles, The Fourth Style of Politics and the Imperial article, I refer to a high point of this discourse. In March 2002, General Tuncer Kılınç, who was the Secretary General of Turkey's National Security Council, at a time when National Security Council was an extremely powerful organization, and the Turkish military had huge political clout in early 2002, openly said in a public symposium that the West does not support or understand Turkey's national security concerns vis-a-vis secessionism, Islamist movements from below, ethnic separatism. Not only that it doesn't understand, but they actively support or abet these threats to Turkish national security, and that's why Turkey should turn its back to West and ally with Russia and Iran against. So this sends shockwaves to people who don't study these intellectual movements, which was very few people, myself, I guess, for example. But this was politically significant because the government, the three-party coalition government of 2002, broke up, collapsed, in great part because of the split between the Europeanists and the Eurasianist faction. Those who favored unconditional EU accession were far more willing to accept the European EU solution for Cyprus, for Iraq, and for many other foreign and domestic problems, whereas the Eurasianist faction thought this is going to lead to the collapse of the Turkish nation state along the lines of the Yugoslav scenario, which was always invoked because it's 1990s, right? Turkey will become next Yugoslavia if we pursue this unconditional kind of EU accession. And the government collapsed, ministers resigned, a new party was formed, it lost its majority in the parliament, early elections were called, and it was a landslide for a completely new party, which is the Justice and Development Party, AK Party, which is still in power in Turkey 21 years later. So because it has been so long, people forget, and very few people study this from the ideological lens, but the very collapse of the last three AK Party government was in great part because of the disagreement between the Europeanists and the Eurasian camp. At least that's my argument. Again, I'm sure it's academia. Many might disagree. As I look briefly, again, any of this you can ask in the Q&A, and I try to write it in as much detail as possible. What Eurasianism suggested for Turkey was at best a tutelary democracy, at worst a military dictatorship domestically, and in foreign policy a pro-Russian orientation. So it is not unfair to say that it resembled, the closest analogy would be a Turkish Baathism. That is so common in much of the Middle East and North Africa, a military dictatorship at home and a quiet Russophile pro-Russian foreign policy abroad. I think that's a good summary. I can go into details if necessary. The low point of Turkish Eurasianism was the Ergenekon trials, when many military officers were arrested and imprisoned, including high-ranking generals, including Tuncay Kılıç, whom I've cited, as part of an alleged plot to overthrow the Turkish government. In retrospect, more than a decade later and in the subsequent trials, the Ergenekon trials itself are now recognized as a Gülenist faction's attempt to cleanse the military from their rivals and to put followers of Fethullah Gülen, the exiled cleric in Pennsylvania, United States, instead of the generals who were purged and put in prison. But with the collapse of the trials themselves and the freeing of the generals after the failed military coup of July 15, 2016, Eurasianism, to a certain extent, was vindicated or exonerated in the eyes of many as an element within the Turkish society, and especially the elite, that saw the threat of Gülenism in the military and bureaucracy and state, and that was, punished for that. This is the summary of the changing of the fortunes and public and elite perceptions of the last 10, 15 years. But I'm more interested in the long-term outcome. I was more interested in the long-term outcome when I published it 20 years ago, and I'm interested in the long-term outcome even today. Eurasianism is now a fixture of Turkish geopolitical thinking. It is one of the four options, hence the fourth style of politics. It did not go away. It may have declined and rose in different periods depending on contextual variables, but there is still, alongside Islamism, which might be, together with Turkism and Pan-Turkism, the most popular geopolitical supranational identities for Turkey. Westernism, which many Anglophone scholars in particular think is some kind of default position of the Turkish state, it's debatable because, again, and this will be the last article reference before I wrap up. If you look at my article, Incompatible Visions of Supranational Identity, published in European Journal of Sociology in 2007, the argument I make is that when we look at Turkish school books, primary, middle school, and beyond, there is no story, supranational story of Turkish nation being a member of a European family of nations. There are alternative stories of Turkish nation being part of a Turkic family of nations from Central Asia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, etc. That's very well known, I think, also internationally. There could easily be a story because of the amount devoted to Ottoman history as a central feature of Turkish history, an Ottoman family of nations from Algeria and Yemen to Bosnia and Kosovo and beyond. But there is no story of the Turkish and the Belgian, Danish and the Swedish nations belonging to a family, right? And this is also why I concluded that article again 17 years ago with a quote from Winston Churchill, where Churchill says, when asked how to define British identity vis-a-vis the European identity, we are with Europe, but not of Europe. We have our own empire and our own Commonwealth. And I said, nothing could sum up the Turkish geopolitical identity better, militarily, economically, and otherwise. We are with Europe, but not of Europe. We have our own empire and our own Commonwealth. At least that's what looks like from including the official teaching of history and identity stories. There is no, again, I was walking around Tbilisi yesterday, and I see many graffiti. Georgia is Europe with the European Union flag everywhere. And I saw this 12 years ago when I came as well, right? Georgia is Europe. With European Union, you won't find this in Turkey. No one is going to put the European Union flag and say, this is our flag, right? This kind of identification, geopolitical identification, that supplants almost your national identity. This does not exist in the Turkish flag. Again, I don't want to generalize it so much, but I think this is an important component of supranational integration schemes, because if you are asked to be part of a common political union, which includes all kinds of sacrifices potentially, you also need some kind of ideational story to support it. There is an ideational story to support a Turkic nation of states, one certainly for Islamic unions of states, and Ottoman union of states that could include the Balkans. That comes closest to the European one, by the way, as I allude to in the final paragraph. But in the Turkish public discourse, as we discussed in previous panels, Ottoman empires have millennium investment and presence in the Balkans, all the way from Slovakia and Budapest down to Skopje and Bulgaria, is never cast as our European civilization. It could have been. For various reasons, and this could be discussed in Q&A because I want to end now, but that's an option that was never pursued. Perhaps because the early Republicans chose a very status quo orientation geopolitically, that they've suppressed so much the existence of Ottoman, Turkish, Islamic Europe, that it did not make its way to the official discourses of our Europe, or we are part of Europe. It could have been, but it isn't. It's just that I'm being completely non-normative, I think, and completely kind of quasi-objective in my reading of what is, not what ought to be. But although it's the fourth one, although it's the smallest one, there is, for the last 25, 30 years, a Russo-Turkish story of identity. Although it's very elite, although it's very small, although it's overrepresented among the very educated and perhaps the bureaucratic, to a certain extent, security elite, this has came into being, and my explanation for it, you've already heard in its basic outlines. I should also mention, and this is the last sentence, and this is the scholars' resentment against the academic community. Many academics, and especially journalists, all of a sudden discovered pro-Russian Turkish Eurasianism after 2016, the failure of the military coup, and you see a plethora of publications, and if it was just discovered, whereas, some people have written about it 15 years before that. Sometimes I get plagiarized. I won't push that. But it's there is a virtue to studying what you think as a student scholar is important, independent of what the fashion of the day is. I can tell you that in 2004, writing about pro-Russian Turkish Eurasianism was not fashionable at all. It was seen probably as a waste of time by many when I was in grad school. But it proved to be consequential, both politically, geopolitically, and somewhat also domestically. Thank you very much for your patience. I look forward to any conversation.
You like research.
Thank you.